This is Letter from America by Stanford Mukasa. Today's topic is a circus of misinformation about sanctions. Letter from America is a weekly in-depth analysis of the situation in Zimbabwe. Letter from America is broadcast on Change Radio, an internet-based radio station of the Zimbabwean diaspora and friends from around the world. Change Radio is aimed specifically at giving Zimbabweans and friends at home and abroad news, information, and a diversity of perspectives that are not available to them in the heavily government-controlled broadcast media in the country. The opinions and views in Letter from America are solely those of the presenter and not necessarily of Change Radio. In today's Letter from America, we will review the visit to Zimbabwe by a United Nations representative or rapporteur. The purpose of the visit by the UN Special Rapporteur is to assess the impact of sanctions on Zimbabwe. Presumably, and according to the government of Zimbabwe, the people of Zimbabwe are being prevented from enjoying their human rights by these sanctions. The government of Zimbabwe is engaged in a circus of misinformation about sanctions. According to an online publication, the United Nations has called on all stakeholders in the Zimbabwe crisis to submit papers on human rights violations and the effects of targeted and economic sanctions placed on Zimbabwe by the US and the European Union in all spheres of human existence. This representative, Alena Douhan, is visiting Zimbabwe from October 18 to 28. Reports say this visit is at the invitation of the government of Zimbabwe. These dates conveniently coincide with the anti-sanctions day of October 25. The Mnangagwa regime managed to coerce SADC member countries into declaring this a SADC anti-sanctions day. Zimbabweans are expected to stage public demonstrations against sanctions. The target of these protests are the United States and the European Union, which have maintained sanctions against Zimbabwe. ZANU-PF's strategy is very clear. They want the United Nations rapporteur to witness the anti-sanctions protests in order to give the impression that Zimbabweans are massively against sanctions and want them to be removed. All the economic problems the country is facing are now being blamed fully and squarely on sanctions. The problem with this ZANU propaganda is that Zimbabweans are not being given the full context in which some sanctions are applied. Zimbabweans have a right to full information on who imposed these sanctions, on whom these sanctions were imposed, why they were imposed, when they were imposed, and how exactly they have impacted the country. These sanctions or restrictive measures were imposed after Zimbabwe stopped repaying its external debts in 2000. Zimbabwe owes more than $10 billion to multilateral financial institutions. The sanctions from the United States were imposed under the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, or ZIDERA, by Congress in 2001. ZIDERA was a direct response to two facts. One, Zimbabwe's default on loan repayments and the systematic repression of human rights by the ZANU-PF regime. ZIDERA was the latest in a series of sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe by multilateral agencies. In September 1999, the IMF suspended its support for economic adjustment and reform in Zimbabwe. In October 1999, the International Development Association suspended or structural adjustment loans, credits, and guarantees to the government of Zimbabwe. In May 2000, the International Development Association suspended all other new lending to the government of Zimbabwe. All of these sanctions came well before ZIDERA was imposed in 2001. Human rights organizations, as well as the U.S. Embassy in Harare, have highlighted significant human rights abuses on Zimbabwe. These abuses by the ZANU-PF government on the human rights of the people of Zimbabwe included: 1. Unlawful and arbitrary killings of civilians, especially supporters of the MDC, the largest opposition party in the country, by security forces. 2. Torture and arbitrary detention of members of the opposition party by security forces. 3. Cases of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. 4. Harsh and life-threatening prison conditions. 5. Political prisoners or detainees being arbitrarily or unlawfully detained. 6. Arbitrary or unlawful interference with the privacy. 7. Serious problems with the independence of the judiciary. 8. Serious government restrictions on free expression, free press, and the internet, including violence, threats of violence, or unjustified arrests or prosecutions against journalists, censorship, site blocking, and the existence of criminal libel laws. 9. Substantial interference with the rights of peaceful assembly and freedom of association. 10. Restrictions on freedom of movement. 11. Restrictions on political participation. 12. Widespread acts of corruption. 13. Lack of investigation of and accountability for violence against women in particular. 14. Crimes involving violence or threats of violence targeting women and girls. And 15. The existence of laws criminalizing consensual same-sex sexual conduct between adults, though not enforced. The embassy charged the government took very few steps to identify or investigate human rights violations in Zimbabwe. However, despite ZIDERA, the United States government continued to fund humanitarian programs in Zimbabwe. Outgoing U.S. Ambassador to Zimbabwe, Brian Nichols, said on October 24, 2019, that the sanctions were targeted to 141 Zimbabweans, out of a population of over 14 million Zimbabweans. And these 141 Zimbabweans had engaged in corruption, they had committed human rights abuses, they had undermined Zimbabwe's democratic process. The ambassador said blaming sanctions is a convenient scapegoat to distract the public from the real reason behind Zimbabwe's economic challenges, namely corruption, economic mismanagement, and failure to respect human rights and uphold the rule of law. Blaming sanctions is a convenient scapegoat. Since 1980, the United States has contributed more than $3 billion in assistance to the Zimbabwean people, and it is the country's largest bilateral donor in health and humanitarian assistance to Zimbabwean population. This is something that you will never hear ZANU-PF and the government of Zimbabwe acknowledge in their anti-sanctions diatribes. The level of corruption in Zimbabwe was and is still staggering. The Mnangagwa regime and ZANU-PF cannot account for more than $1 billion every year. According to the annual reports of the country's Auditor General, the most conspicuous example is the more than $2.8 billion missing from command agricultural subsidies. This money could have benefited up to 50% of the population who face food insecurity, and hospitals lack basic supplies, life-saving medicine, and medical equipment. In 2019, Clement Nyaletsosi Vule, the United Nations representatives on rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and of association, reported gross human rights violations in Zimbabwe after he had visited that country. In his preliminary findings, Mr. Vule gave reports of excessive, disproportionate, and lethal use of force against protesters through the use of tear gas, batons, and live ammunition. Vule wrote in his preliminary findings that he lamented the loss of lives due to excessive use of force against protesters. He urged the government to thoroughly investigate the incidents and prosecute those responsible. This is something the government of Zimbabwe has never done. There is a Shona saying, Rinemanyanga areputirwe. This means the truth cannot be hidden forever. The truth in Zimbabwe is that sanctions, the real sanctions in Zimbabwe, are the human rights abuses, and these human rights abuses continue. The anti-sanctions protest that will be stage managed by Mnangagwa's regime will not be effective or successful in hiding this truth. The truth that ZANU-PF and the government of Zimbabwe does not respect or uphold democracy, human rights, civil liberties, and the rule of law. What Zidera required and still requires is for ZANU-PF government to respect the rule of law, to respect human rights and democracy for all Zimbabweans. And this is Zidera's precondition for lifting of sanctions. And Zidera offers more than $20 million to help Zimbabwe to meet these conditions. And the facts on the matter is, or are, that ZANU-PF government have failed to meet some very basic human rights, rule of law requirement. And that is why sanctions will continue. In 1974, the firebrand Catholic bishop of the then Mutare, Bishop Donald Lamont, responded to the then Prime Minister Ian Smith, who had labeled the ZANU and ZAPU freedom fighters as terrorists. The real terrorists, Bishop Lamont said, are the people who imposed white minority rule on the majority of the population. If Bishop Lamont was alive today, he would say the real sanctions in Zimbabwe are the human rights abuses, corruption, arbitrary arrests inflicted by the ZANU-PF on the people of Zimbabwe. You have been listening to Letter from America, a weekly in-depth analysis of the situation in Zimbabwe. Letter from America is broadcast on Change Radio, an internet-based radio station of the Zimbabwean diaspora and friends from around the world. Change Radio is aimed specifically at giving Zimbabweans and friends at home and abroad news, information, and a diversity of perspectives that are not available to them in the heavily government-controlled broadcast media in the country. The opinions and views expressed in Letter from America are solely those of the presenter and not necessarily of Change Radio.
celebration changing communities, changing ndichibva pagweru apo paguta guru remumidlands ndiri uyezve ndiri secretary for recruitment province yemadzimai ndiri kufara nhasi nechirongwa mukomana ngapinde zvake nokuti ndini the winner of the week. Tine maprogram edu atiri kuita semasecretary of recruitment tiri kutora vechidiki vese vari kukwanisa ma18 years nevasina mbogara vanyoresa kuvhota vechidiki nemadzimai echidikiwo tichivadzidzisa kupinda mupolitics tichivakurudzira kuti vainde vanorejista kuvhota kuitira kuti mukomana apinde zvake mukomana ngapinde tiri kuita nezvecompetition mukomana ngapinde yatekeshera Zimbabwe yese yatekeshera pasi rese saka isu tiri kuti mukomana ngapinde